Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going way back to explore a really fascinating and kind of a surprising chapter in American history. It's about the very first Muslims in the U.S. You know, when we were discussing this before the show, you shared some just incredible research with me that really made me rethink, the typical story of when Islam actually first appeared in the United States.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be really amazing to kind of unpack that history, highlight some things that most people probably don't know, and also, get into the resilience of those very first Muslim communities.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things that comes out of looking at this history is that, it challenges the kind of popular assumption that Islam is a recent arrival in America.
Right.
It's something that's purely tied to, recent immigration patterns in the 20th century.
Right.
When in reality, the story goes back much further.
Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, the common narrative, it does start much, much later.
Yeah.
But this document, this untitled document.pdf you shared, it really emphasizes that the first Muslims arrived centuries ago.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with that deeper history?
So, the reality is that the first significant Muslim presence in America wasn't through, voluntary immigration, but through the transatlantic slave trade.
Wow.
It's estimated that maybe 10% to 30% of the enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas were actually Muslim.
Oh, wow. That's a huge number, a huge range when you think about the sheer scale of that forced migration.
Right.
And, it really makes you think differently about America's, religious origins.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that these individuals were stripped of their freedom, taken from their homes, but they came with their own religious and cultural identities. And a huge part of that was Islam.
Right.
Do we know, were there specific regions in West Africa that contributed more to this Muslim enslaved population?
Yeah, the document you sent mentions this. A lot of these enslaved Africans came from parts of West Africa that had well-established Islamic scholarship and communities. Yeah. Places like present-day Senegal, Mali, Nigeria.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really a forced integration of Islamic traditions into the very fabric of early America from the very beginning.
Yeah. That's sobering to think about. And in this tragic context, are there any particular stories that can help us connect with this early Muslim presence? I know the document mentioned someone named Estevanico.
Yes. So Estevanico, who's also sometimes known as Mustafa Azemmouri, he offers one of the earliest documented examples. He was a Moroccan Berber, which is a North African ethnic group that has a really long history with Islam. And he actually arrived in Florida way back in 1528 as part of a Spanish expedition.
Wow.
And it's just a reminder that even this, really early presence was tied to that brutal reality of enslavement.
Right.
He wasn't here by choice.
Right. His story, even though it's so significant, it really highlights that involuntary nature of this initial, wave of Muslims arriving.
Right.
Were there other, notable figures among the enslaved people who help us understand this history a bit more?
Absolutely. The document mentions several figures whose stories are really important to understand. For instance, there's Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. He was born in what is today's Senegal around, I think, the late 1600s, early 1700s. He was a Fulani Muslim scholar. The Fulani are a really large West African ethnic group, many of whom are Muslim, and he ended up enslaved in Maryland. What's so remarkable about his story is that even while enslaved, his knowledge of the Quran in Arabic was recognized. And eventually he gained his freedom and even returned to Africa.
That's incredible. I mean, just the fact that he was able to retain that level of religious knowledge and was actually even recognized for it.
Yeah.
It says a lot about the strength of those traditions. They weren't easily erased. And then there's also Omar ibn Said, another West African Muslim scholar who was enslaved in North Carolina. What makes his story so impactful?
Yeah, so what's really, I think, poignant about Omar ibn Said's story is that while he was enslaved, he continued to write Islamic texts in Arabic.
Wow.
And so this is tangible evidence of his faith persisting under really oppressive conditions.
Yeah.
It's an incredible It's a real window into like his inner world and that unwavering commitment to his faith.
Yeah, it's amazing. Just the act of writing, preserving those texts in that context. It's a powerful testament to his resilience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this document also mentions Rahman Ibrahima Sori.
Yeah, so Rahman Ibrahima Sori was actually a prince from West Africa.
Wow.
He was enslaved in Mississippi for 40 years before he finally gained his freedom.
Wow.
And his story really underscores, just how diverse the backgrounds were from which these enslaved Muslims came.
Right.
They weren't a monolithic group. Some of them, like him, had held really high positions of status back in their homelands.
Right. So we have, Estevanico's forced arrival, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo's, that religious knowledge that he preserved, Omar ibn Said's writing, and then Rahman Ibrahima Sori's diverse background.
Right.
It starts to paint a picture of that first wave of Muslims in America. Tragic, but definitely present.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond these specific individuals, how common was the actual practice of Islam among the enslaved population?
While the conditions of slavery made it really difficult, to practice openly, the document suggests that a lot of enslaved Muslims did secretly maintain aspects of their faith.
Right.
They might recite Quranic verses, they might pray in hidden places, or pass down religious knowledge through, oral tradition. It's remarkable. I mean, it speaks to their resilience and, just how deeply important their faith was to them as a source of strength and identity.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's hard to even imagine how they managed to do those things in secret. I mean, were there any documented instances of how they did this?
The document really highlights the challenges in finding explicit documentation because of the nature of slavery itself,
right,
which was intended to erase, cultural and religious identities.
Right.
However, some historical accounts and narratives from enslaved people sometimes offer little glimpses.
Yeah.
There might be mentions of specific names with Arabic origins or descriptions of dietary restrictions that align with Islamic practices. It's kind of like piecing together these little fragments of evidence to try to understand that hidden history.
Right. Right. Okay, so we have this first wave of Muslims who arrived, through this horrible system of slavery.
Right.
But then the document also talks about these later waves of immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries, which is, a totally different chapter.
Right.
A chapter of voluntary migration.
Right. And this period marks, the beginning of Muslims choosing to come to the United States. And it adds a really important layer to this whole history.
Right.
And these immigrants came from all over the world. We see lots of people arriving from the Ottoman Empire, which, as you know, included parts of what are now Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey.
Yeah.
But the document also mentions immigrants from South Asia. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even places in Eastern Europe like Albania and Bosnia.
Right. And that's so interesting because it shows how globally diverse the Muslim world is.
Oh, yeah.
And how that diversity was reflected in these early immigrant communities in America.
Absolutely, yeah. Islam in America has always been, kind of a mosaic of different cultures and ethnic backgrounds.
Right.
And, these immigrants, they tended to settle in growing cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York. And it's in those places that we start to see the very first organized Muslim communities in the U.S. They started to establish mosques, which was a major step towards building a kind of communal religious life.
Yeah, that's a huge turning point, going from those individual, often secret practices of the enslaved people to openly building religious communities.
Exactly.
I know the document mentions some key moments in this period, like the very first recorded Muslim community in 1907, which was in Ross, North Dakota, founded by Syrian and Lebanese immigrants.
Yeah, it's interesting because you wouldn't necessarily think of North Dakota as one of those early centers of Muslim life in America.
Right, exactly.
But it just shows that these communities were really popping up all over the country.
Yeah.
Driven by opportunity and the challenges of settling in this new land.
Right.
And then, of course, a really key moment was the building of the Mother Mosque of America in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1929.
Yeah.
That was the very first purpose-built mosque in the U.S. It's a real symbol of the growing establishment of Islam in America. It wasn't just a building, it was a real statement. It showed that Muslims were here to stay and that they were dedicated to building a strong communal religious identity within America. It represented a shift from, simply trying to survive to actually flourishing.
It's a powerful symbol. And then, moving forward in the timeline, we get to the 1930s and the rise of the Nation of Islam. The document really emphasizes its role in spreading Islam, especially among African Americans.
Yeah.
Can you speak more on that?
Yeah, so what's really interesting here is that the Nation of Islam offered this kind of distinct vision of Islamic identity,
Right.
but within like the context of American racial dynamics.
Right.
And as the document mentions, the later prominence of figures like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali,
Right.
they really brought international attention to Islam in America and
Oh.
shaped how people viewed it.
Right, absolutely. Those figures, I mean, they had such global influence. They really amplified the presence and the diversity of Muslim voices in America and on the world stage.
Yeah.
So when you take all of this together, from those first enslaved Africans who are Muslim to these later waves of immigrants, it really becomes clear that Islam has a far deeper and more complex history in America than most people realize.
Absolutely.
You agree?
Yeah, yeah. And it's a history that's full of suffering, but also just incredible resilience. Despite facing the horrors of slavery and the challenges of coming to a new country, these early Muslims held on to their faith and built these amazing communities.
Right, right.
And, their ability to do that against such odds, it's really inspiring. They really paved the way for the vibrant and diverse Muslim American community that exists today,
Yeah.
which includes, African Americans, immigrants from all different parts of the world, and converts.
Yeah.
They're all, building on the legacy of those who came before.
And thinking about, the bigger picture, this history really forces us to rethink what it means to be American.
Yeah.
It shows us that America is made up of all these different cultures and faiths. And the story of those early Muslims is a crucial part of that, even if it's often overlooked.
It's a reminder that American identity has always been evolving.
Right.
And different faiths, including Islam, have played a big role in shaping that identity.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how these different threads have come together to create the complex, ever-changing story of this country.
Right, right. So much to consider.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It was a really enlightening conversation.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I think, this is part of American history that deserves more attention.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring and keep asking questions.